Welcome to the Freeborn Podcast. My name is Mike Jackson. Today, let's talk a little bit about a Christian response to the protests and riots that are devastating many parts of our country and even have worked their way around the world. This, as probably every single person who's listening to me knows, all started when 4 police officers were involved in an incident that resulted in the death of a man named George Floyd. The officers in question have been arrested and are pending trial for charges on murder in the second degree and other lesser charges as well. As a result of this, there have been a number of protests that have engulf many of the neighborhoods in the major cities in the United States, including some here in San Antonio, Texas, but also in Dallas, Houston, and other areas. I know that a great portion of the protesters are peaceful. They are trying to have their voice be heard by the authorities. And I think there are many Christians who are sympathetic with that cause. And they see that it's almost a Christian imperative that we be sympathetic with this cause. However, I think that Christians should be very, very careful. I think they should consider what they are subscribing to, what they are supporting as they support these protesters. Now, I know that practically all Christians condemn the rioters. They want no part or association with the rioters. They think they want to associate with the protesters only. And I understand why some of you might be of that persuasion and might think that is possible. However, even if we eliminate the rioters from the mix and only consider the protest and assume that the protest was perfectly peaceful, there are a number of problems with this protest and with the people that are aligning themselves with this that I think should give Christians pause in participating and in supporting it and in sympathizing with it. First off, I don't think that anyone knows what they're actually protesting about. And I say anyone, I realize there may be a few, but I think that the vast majority of the people in these protests, and I'm only speaking of the peaceful ones. I'm not grouping the rioters and the bad elements on any side of the issue into that mix. But let's say we live in this ideal world and all that vanishes, all the negative elements of this vanish, and all that are left are the peaceful, outraged citizens who want the authorities to hear their voice. I don't think the majority of them have any clue what they're actually protesting about, not in any type of accuracy or any type of precision. If you're sympathetic with these protests, I would love to hear from you. Tell me in the comments section or email me at podcast@freebornchurch.com and tell me what it is exactly you're protesting, or what it is you're sympathetic with what the protesters are protesting. Maybe you're not actually marching with them, fine, but you're sympathetic with them. So tell me, what is it exactly we are protesting? Exactly. Because if we're not protesting something exactly, if we can't articulate what it is we're protesting, then this is all just a huge fad in which, in order to be part of the thing that is happening, in order to be part of the cool movement, everyone's jumping on board with this. Is anyone articulating what it is exactly they're upset about, other than F the police? Other than that. And is that really what you think is the message that we need to send? Do you think that the minuscule number of people per year who are killed by the police are sufficient cause for this response? Is this proportional to the problem? So if the problem is that the police kill people, unarmed citizens, I would ask you, How many unarmed citizens a year are killed by the police? If it's the problem is that the police kill anybody at all, how many people are killed by the police every year? Now, if you don't know the answer to those questions without Googling it, then you don't know what you're protesting. You say, well, I'm protesting that the police are abusing their power and that they are abusive to citizenry. Okay? How many people are abused by the police every year? How many people have interactions with the police that result in the use of force every year? If you don't know the answer to these questions, then you don't know what you're protesting. You don't know what you're sympathizing with in the case that you're not actually protesting, you're just a sympathizer, that's fine. You don't know what you're sympathizing with. You don't know what you're supporting. You don't know what you are you don't know what you are tweeting and posting about if you don't know the answer to these questions. How many people do you think are killed by the police every year? 10,000? 5,000? 3,000? I mean, in the entire country. I mean, there's a lot of people in the country. So the country's about 300 plus, maybe 330 million people live in this country. And the police interact with them every day. Every day. There's police. And we're talking about all police at all levels, local, state, federal. How many people do you think the police shoot every day? Now, if we watch the movies, well, they shoot 5 or 6 or 10 or maybe even 50 in a single day. One policeman will, and he never reloads. He can do it without even reloading his weapon. But in real life, how many people do you think are killed by the police every year in the entire country? So if you answered 3,000, you're wrong. By a multiple of 3, meaning there are roughly 1,000 people who are killed in this country every year. And only about 20 of them are unarmed. So 20 people are killed by the police every year who are unarmed. And less than half of those are black. So what is it exactly we're protesting? Now you might say that any unarmed person killed by the police is one too many. Now, most policemen would agree with you. Most policemen have no interest in killing anybody. In fact, I've spoken to policemen. We had one on our podcast this week who was a San Antonio police officer in patrol on the rough side of town for 25 years. And he never fired his weapon in anger. He never fired his weapon in self-defense or to hit any or to shoot anybody in 25 years. And that is actually the case of most policemen. The vast majority of most policemen never shoot anybody. Never fire their weapon discharge their weapon in the performance of their duty. So the police would agree that anyone dying from a police action is undesirable. That is not what they want. Nobody wants that. But are we going to protest in every major city in America because 9 people die at the hand of the police when they're unarmed? Now remember, unarmed does not mean that they were not a danger to the policeman. If a criminal is choking a police officer and the police officer manages to get his gun out and shoot him in order to save his own life, that would be considered shooting an unarmed man. There are actually very few instances where policemen kill a suspect or an individual who presents no danger to them. It does happen, and when it does happen, it is investigated as it should be. And generally speaking, the police officers lose their job and are sentenced as criminals. Now, I'm not saying that always happens. Is there injustice in our system? Absolutely. Do things go through the cracks? Yes, they do. But here's the question. The other thing would be then, what is it you're protesting? Are you protesting racism? Do you believe the police departments are practicing systemic, widespread racism? Well, that also does not bear up to the facts. So you might quote the article that has been released and has been republished in a number of publications that says that black men are likely to encounter death by the hand of the police at a rate of 1 out of every 1,000, meaning 1 out of every 1,000 black men are likely to be killed by the police. Now, this statistic is completely wrong. It isn't just a little wrong, it's absolutely wrong. There are 6 million black men in the country that are of the age that they would have interactions with the police. So we're going to discount the children and we're going to discount the elderly and only talk about those that actually have a chance of interacting with the police. There are 6 million of them. Every year, there are roughly 300 black men are killed by the police each year. 300 out of 6 million. That isn't even close to 1 in 1,000. That's more like 1 in 25,000. Far, far fewer than what they're saying. So what is it we're protesting? You say, well, police target black people because they're racist, because the system is racist, because that's what that means when you say systemic racism. So if you don't know how to define systemic racism, you don't know what you're protesting. Systemic racism means that racism is built into the system. It's not that there are individuals who in their heart hate people of other ethnicities. It is that regardless of each individual's feelings towards those of another race or ethnicity or skin color, regardless of their feelings, the system forces them to act as if they were racists. You can find an example of this in old Jim Crow South. When blacks were not allowed to go into restaurants or swimming pools or other places that were reserved for whites, this wasn't only because the proprietor or the owner of these places didn't want them there. In fact, quite the opposite many times. This was because there were laws imposed in the South called Jim Crow laws that did not allow blacks to be in those places. Even if the owner of the restaurant wanted to serve them, he was not allowed to. Even if the owner of the swimming pool had no problem with blacks swimming in his pool, they were not allowed to by penalty of law. That is what systemic racism looks like. You can have a society where you have widespread individual racism. In other words, hatred in people's hearts towards people that are different than themselves based on skin color, based on ethnicity, based on genetic descendancy. You can have a society that has widespread individual racism and yet no systemic racism. You can have a society that has systemic racism but very little individual racism. These are both possible. They are not the same thing. So finding a single person in Minneapolis who might hate black people and will use the power of his office, the power of his position to inflict pain, suffering, and even death on a black person because of his hatred in his heart towards black people as a whole, that doesn't prove that the entire police department of Minneapolis has built into its rules, regulations, code, and culture a hatred towards black people. Now, how could we distinguish between what might be individual racism and what might be systemic racism in any particular case? Well, the statistics do help determine that. So when we look at the statistics dealing with the interactions between the police and the black community, you might say, well, blacks are stopped more often in traffic stops than whites are. And you would be correct. They are, even proportionally to their population. However, there's a couple things you have to consider. One is that studies have shown that black people as a population tend to speed more than white people. So blacks, even though they are, say, 13% of the overall population, they're closer to 25 to 30% of the population that speeds in their car. Excuse me. So when we start considering what percentage of the people who speed this one particular ethnicity constitutes, well, then we find that they're not actually being targeted by the police at any higher rate than whites are, in so much as they speed in proportion to their population. And so we can't look at just the crude numbers. We have to weigh them for what part of the criminal element or the law-breaking element each population makes up. Let me give you an example of something where this breaks down. So if cops are targeting a specific race or a specific skin color, especially let's just keep it all within the perspective of driving. So the narrative is that cops are disproportionately targeting blacks in traffic stops. And they substantiate that by showing that more blacks get traffic speeding tickets than whites do. And they say, see there, if a cop sees a black man drive by, he's going to pull him over because he's black. Okay. But when we look at DUIs, we don't find this at all. So why would that be? They're still driving cars. Allegedly, the cops are pulling over blacks at a higher rate than whites. And so when there's a DUI sting operation, you would expect to find more blacks getting DUIs than whites. Wouldn't you? But that's not what we find. In fact, whites are overrepresented in DUI stops and arrests. White people make up about 65%, 68% of the population of the U.S. right now, but they represent 80% of the young DUI arrests. So we're only looking at people that are ages 18 to 34, basically. And in that age group, whites comprise over 80% of DUI arrests. And blacks comprise 6% of DUI arrests. Now that's half of their population. So white people are 2 to 3 times more likely to be arrested for DUI than black people. So where did the racism go when the same police departments are targeting DUI stops? So are you saying that when the police are sent out in the morning to do a DUI sting, or in the evening, I should say, and they're gonna go and stake out and be looking for DUIs, that they're told, or they're trained, or their culture is such in their department that they just all of a sudden forget that they've been targeting black people all day for all other types of traffic stops, and for this type of traffic stop, they're only going to target white people. This is why you have to get all the information on these things. It's too easy to say that the police are institutionally or systemically racist, because the systems, when they're analyzed, do not display this bias. If blacks are being targeted by the police for all crimes, why aren't they being targeted for arson? You might say that with DUI, it's just too hard to target the blacks because they're not weaving all over the road. Only the whites weave all over the road. Fair enough. So let's think about arson. Arson is generally not a crime that is solved by the police coming upon the scene of the crime at the moment of the crime. Meaning, generally arson is not solved because the police happen to see the person starting the fire and they run up and grab them. Arson is solved by investigating the scene after the fact and coming up with suspects and chasing down the leads and making a case against a suspect. Okay, so if there is systemic racism, then you would expect to find more blacks convicted of arson than whites, because the narrative is that the police don't do any real investigative work. They don't care who actually committed the crime. They just go round up the nearest black person and frame them for the crime. That's the narrative. That's what you're protesting, right? That the police don't actually get real criminals. They just make up charges against people. So why aren't they making up charges of arson against the blacks? Because whites comprise the vast majority, even greater than their proportion of population of arsonists. Far more whites are convicted of arson than blacks, even proportional to their population. So how is it that the racism that is systemic in the police department, meaning it's built into the system, into the laws, or into the rules, or into the culture, how does that disappear when arson becomes the issue? Is there some systemic exception that all policemen are aware of, that all district attorneys are aware of, that whenever it's arson involved, you can't frame the black person? Is that what we're saying? Why don't we talk about gambling? Gambling is one of the few arrests that is dominated in proportion to their population by the Asians. Asians form 1 or less % of the arrests of almost all crimes. But when it comes to sex crimes and gambling, Asians are way overrepresented in proportion to their population. So about 3% of all the arrests on gambling are of Asians. But Asians are not 3% of the population. So on all other crimes, the police arrest Asians proportionally to their population or less. But when it comes to gambling, the whole system has decided to target Asians. Is that what you're protesting? The problem I have now, looking at this from the perspective of Christianity, is that Christians should be better than this. I do not support, and I can't believe I even have to say this. It's absurd that anyone would have to say this, but just so it's been said, I do not support racism, police brutality, abuse of power. I do not support policemen beating up suspects. None of that is acceptable, and all of it should be investigated and should be tried in a court of law, and the people who do it should be held accountable. I don't think police should have immunity from prosecution. I don't think anybody should have immunity from prosecution, and especially not the police. All that being said, that does not mean that there is any amount of systemic racism in this country. And if any of you think that there is, I would love for you to tell me where it is and what the evidence is that it exists. One thing that people say is that blacks are arrested at a much higher rate than whites are, and that is true. But if it's about racism, then that means it's about their skin color, correct? So that's what we're protesting, that people with darker skin are arrested more frequently than people with lighter skin. Then why aren't black women arrested more frequently? A black woman is 33 times less likely to be arrested than a black man. So does racism not extend past gender? So what is this? Is this sexism or racism? And then why aren't black men above the age of 34 being arrested with the same frequency? Are the cops able to distinguish as the car zips by that a man is actually older than 34 and therefore is not interested in practicing his systemic racism? Is there some unwritten code in the police departments that say that you can harass a 20 to 34-year-old, but once they clear that 34-year mark, then they're free from the cops. Because black men over the age of 34 are 2 to 3 times less likely to be arrested than younger men. So is it ageism? What exactly are we protesting here? So we're protesting that 20 to 34-year-old black males are more likely to be arrested by the police than white people. But how much more likely are they to be involved in crime? Well, many, many more times than they're likely to be arrested. 50% of all the murders in America are committed by black people, mainly black men ages 20 to 34. They commit the bulk of those murders. Even though blacks are killed by the cops disproportionately to their population, black young men between the ages of 20 and 34 disproportionately kill cops also. This does not mean that blacks deserve mistreatment. That's absurd. This doesn't mean that the police are justified in abusing their power or beating up a suspect or killing somebody, even somebody who resists arrest. None of this justifies criminal behavior on behalf of the policeman. But when you come out and you say that you're protesting systemic racism by the police departments, I would challenge you to show me where it's at. And you're welcome to use the recent incident in Minneapolis as an example if you'd like. But I've watched the video. I see no evidence of racism. Where is the racism in this? You say, well, if he'd been white, he wouldn't have died. Well, how do you figure? More white people are killed by cops than black people. Just because it doesn't come across your Twitter feed, just because it doesn't come across your Instagram feed, doesn't mean it didn't happen. Maybe before you protest something you don't understand, you should go and look that up. You should go and see the number of people who are all white people who are killed by the police every year. Now, this isn't to say we should cry for the white people and not for the black people. This is to say that there is no racism. This simply doesn't exist systemically. I'm not even convinced there's hardly any racism individually. I know it's popular to think of America as a racist nation, but I've lived in countries that I think have widespread individual racism. And I don't see that attitude in America. Now, that's my opinion. And it's a very hard one to prove. The data to prove the existence or the absence of individual racism would be very hard to come across. However, I think there are strong indications that individual racism is a thing of our past, not a thing of our present. One of the evidences that I think is very compelling that there is no individual racism to speak of. I'm not saying there aren't some people out there who are racist. There are some. These are fringe elements of our society. These are not any of our politicians. These are not any of the leaders of our nation. These aren't any of the influential or well-known people. These aren't even the majority of your neighbors. These are fringe elements that everybody condemns and everybody looks down on. Where is one of the strong evidences, in my opinion, that there is essentially no individual racism in America is that we have to use people like George Floyd and others like him as martyrs to the cause of racism. If there was systemic racism, for sure, but even if there was only widespread individual racism in the nation, We wouldn't need to pick somebody of the dubious moral character of George Floyd as the hero for the anti-racism movement. We could have our pick of doctors and lawyers and soldiers and policemen and all other forms of honorable people who have no criminal records, who did not storm into somebody's house, who did not bust down some pregnant woman's door and hold her hostage while they stole her stuff. We wouldn't need people like that to make martyrs out of. One of the influential conservative writers wrote that the black community is unique in its idolatry of its worst elements, meaning that the black community idolizes its criminals. And while that may be true, and that's a separate discussion, it also points out what I'm saying. The reason why all these race baiters are so quick to canonize George Floyd is because they don't have a better example of it. But if racism is as widespread as these protests would make us think that we need to protest in every city in America over the widespread racism that's everywhere, well, then why would we need somebody of such dubious moral character to be our standard bearer, to be our martyr for our cause? Why would we need that? Wouldn't we have thousands upon thousands of righteous black men and women who are being trampled on by the systemic racist system that we could uphold and show nurses and doctors and teachers and scientists and decent, honest mechanics and hardworking construction workers all being oppressed by this systemic moral system, being killed by the policemen? If the police are out targeting black people, not black criminals, just black people, then why don't we have doctors being killed by the police at any higher rate than any other ethnicity? Are there innocent black people killed by the police? Absolutely. Without a doubt. The police make mistakes. Some of them are corrupt. Some of them are downright mean and abusive and have a God complex. And they kill people. Some black people, some white people, Asians, of all nationalities and ethnicities. Besides serial killers, I don't know of anybody who is targeting black people, which leads me to that. Did you know that serial killers are far more likely to target blacks than any other ethnicity? Now, I don't know why that is. I'm not a psychologist. I can't give you the reason for that. But those are the facts. But besides serial killers, who is targeting black people because they're black? Because if they're targeting black people because they're black, then it can't be because they're men, and it can't be because they're 20 to 34 years of age. None of those issues would matter to a racist. Do you think that in Jim Crow South, the rule was that black men between the ages of 20 and 34 were not allowed in the pool? Everyone else is welcome. No. It didn't matter your age. It didn't matter your gender. It didn't matter your level of education. When Jim Crow South was discriminating against blacks, it included everybody, including the famous ones. Famous singers, performers, dancers, sports players. People that whites would spend a lot of money to go listen to go watch, to enjoy the entertainment, were then afterwards not allowed to walk through the front door of the same restaurant they performed in. It didn't matter your age. It didn't matter your gender. It didn't matter what your economic status was, your income was. It didn't matter. It didn't matter what your net worth was. Is that what you think you see today? Is that what you think you're protesting? That doesn't exist. Not in America. Are you sad about that? You're sad you missed out on the civil rights movement? Trying to recapture that? Trying to arrogate a little bit of that immortality for yourself? Picturing yourself as being one of the freedom riders? You're going to bring about change to America? What is it exactly you think you're going to stop? As far as I can tell, the number of police interactions that result in death are so few that the only way we are going to lessen them, the only way we are going to make them less than they already are, is by getting rid of the police. Which is exactly what they're now saying they're going to do. LA has cut the police budget by millions of dollars. Minneapolis is floating the idea of completely disbanding the police. There are places where liberals are reporting on Twitter that when they call the police because the rioters are getting close to their homes, which is ironical and actually a little comical, but when they call the police are telling them that they are not responding to those calls and that the homeowners need to take care of themselves. The only way we are going to reduce the number of people who die as a result of interaction with the police from the number we're at now is by no longer interacting with the citizenry. That means the police will no longer issue tickets. Now, you may think that's a good thing. We all may think that's wonderful. Nobody likes to get a ticket, and if they were to say, the police, we have analyzed this, and out of X number of traffic stops, we have Y number of deaths. And so we are simply going to quit enforcing traffic laws. Do you know what the streets will look like then? Is that really what you want? Because out of every X number of traffic stops, you're going to have a Y number, corresponding number of deaths. Whenever the police interact with the citizens, there is a potential of something going wrong. And the dynamics of that situation are so fluid that it is impossible to predict what that could be, or to make it, or to how would I put it? It is impossible to categorize it in any simple way. The police often are involved in use of deadly force with motorists, not because they are pursuing somebody who is armed and dangerous and wanted, but simply because of a routine traffic stop. The Oklahoma City bomber was caught by a routine traffic stop. Had he been so inclined, he might have tried to shoot his way out of that interaction. They weren't looking for that truck, and they weren't looking for him, and they weren't targeting scrawny young men with half a beard. The truck was not roadworthy, according to state guidelines. I think it was missing a tail light, or there was something wrong with the truck. So they pulled it over as a routine traffic stop. And that's how they caught him. This happens often. Criminals are not smart. One of the greatest oxymorons of the English language is criminal mastermind. Criminals are not masterminds. Most criminals actually have a very low IQ, technically speaking. Most criminals have a very low IQ. In fact, that's studies that have been done, and it shows that the high IQ killers, especially serial killers, prefer poison and bombs, meaning they'd rather not risk themselves to kill somebody. And that those that use firearms, blunt weapons, use knives, and other forms of killing people in a personal, intimate way, all have IQs of 80 and below. These are not masterminds. And so whenever the police interact with the citizenry, you're going to have a percentage of those interactions are going to result in death of somebody, whether it be the police officer or the subject. The only way you're going to reduce it below a certain number is by completely getting rid of the police. Why do you think the police are doing very little in these riots? There's black people committing crimes in broad daylight, and white people, and Asians, all kinds of people doing it. But obviously, you think the police are racist and that they're out to get the blacks. So why aren't they arresting blacks wholesale? It seems to me that right now, that would be on sale. It's like it's a special in aisle 5. Why aren't the police cleaning up? Now they can fulfill their dreams of imprisoning the entire black population. Why aren't they doing this? Because if they start interacting with these rioters, they know what's going to happen. A good percentage, a significant percentage of those interactions are going to result in the death of somebody. And so they're just watching it happen. Is that the world you want to live in? Is that what you're protesting? Do you want to live in the world where the police do not act? Where the police show up far after, long after, all the crime has been committed? They take down a few names, pat a few people on the shoulder, offer the condolences to the family, and move on to the next call. Is that the world you want to live in? Is that the world you're protesting for? What is it you want the police to do? You tell me. You have all these answers. You've obviously thought this through very carefully. You've obviously done all the research. You have all the data. You know all the statistics. You're so well informed. So you tell me. In a country of 330 million people, we have 1,000 deaths by police per year. How are you going to reduce that number? Give me specific policy implementations, policy changes, that is going to reduce that number to 0, or to 500, or to 250. What exactly do you want them to do? I think Christians should be able to answer those questions before they start protesting in grand scale. I think Christians should consider and think about all the information and not be carried about with the mob. The New Testament enjoins us that we not be conformed to this world. We need to be very careful. This world is sick in the head. And I mean that in a technical way. They have an illness in their thinking. They do not think straight. They act and talk and react without information, without any stated goals or plans. They do not have any plan whatsoever. They're rushing headlong into behavior that is emboldening and is protecting and giving refuge to the worst elements of our society. If it wasn't for the protesters, there would be no rioters. You do understand that, right? The rioters are not the ones casting shade for the protesters. It's the other way around. The reason why the police, the National Guard, are not able to control the rioters is because the protesters are protecting them by virtue of being there. And you might argue that that is simply the price to be paid for speaking the truth to power. But what truth are you speaking? None of your information is accurate. Your opinions are not based on fact or data. You are simply parroting what you read in an Instagram post or a Facebook post or something you picked up on Twitter. You have not analyzed the situation carefully. So what is it you are protesting? What is it you think will be accomplished? What can be accomplished? Now you might think, well, we're going to get Minneapolis to drop the hammer on these bad cops. What does New York have to do with that? What does San Antonio have to do with that? Do you think Minneapolis is going to capitulate from their alleged systemic racism because you burned down the city of San Antonio, because you graffiti the Alamo? You think Minneapolis is going to capitulate because people in Toluca, Mexico, in London, England, are protesting? None of this makes any sense. When the civil rights heroes marched against the bigotry and the actual real racism, systemic racism of their time, they didn't march in cities that were disconnected. They went to the places where that racism existed. And they didn't take sticks and rocks and guns and weapons. And they did not allow the criminal element to infiltrate their protest. You cannot be standing amongst the rioters saying that that's not you. Do not conform yourself to the world. You need to be transformed, reformed in the spirit of your mind. That's what we've been called to do. Christians care about the truth. If there were actual racism in this country, if I could find any systemic racism at all, I would denounce it. I denounce the racism of the South. I am probably one of the few conservatives who think they should tear down all the Confederate statues. Of course they should. I think it's absurd to say that that's history. I don't think we should erase names from history books. That's absurd also. History books should tell us what Robert E. Lee fought for, why he fought for the South and betrayed the North. They should tell us that. But we don't need a monument to Robert E. Lee or any of the other Southern generals or Southern leaders during the Confederacy. This whole idea that they were these noble patriots fighting for a view of federalism that had been abandoned by the Union, that's absolute nonsense. They were fighting for slavery. And it doesn't matter if you point out that Robert E. Lee himself or Stonewall Jackson didn't own slaves. 90% of the Southerners did not own slaves. 90% did not own slaves. One of the greatest cons in history was the Southern slave owners, the top 10% of the South, convincing, brainwashing all the Southerners to fight and die for slavery when they were actually themselves never going to be able to own a slave. Owning slaves was very expensive. Most Southern farmers were too ignorant to understand that slavery was not only endangering the wage system in the North, it had already destroyed the capability of the average Southern farmer to make a decent living for himself and not be simply a subsistence farmer. So we should not be memorializing these people. We shouldn't have monuments to them. Those monuments should all be taken down. No government should be allowed to rule under the auspices of any Confederate symbol. The Confederate symbols are symbols of actual racism. They are symbols of actual tyranny. They are symbols of actual rebellion and treason. They shouldn't exist in any government or official way. They should not be memorialized. They should not be exalted. Robert E. Lee was not an honorable person in his official capacity. You may have been able to live next to him and thought he was wonderful. But the cause he was fighting for was despicable. I don't care how he framed it in his own mind. It doesn't matter how Stonewall Jackson framed this in his own mind. He was fighting for slavery. It was not about states' rights. It doesn't matter if he thought it was in his own mind. These men, they signed on, they made allegiance with the wrong crowd. Maybe in their mind, they were upholding states' rights, but the Confederate Constitution was very clear. No state of the Confederacy had the freedom, the right to outlaw slavery. That's not states' rights. They were fighting for slavery. And even the people of them who did not agree with slavery and believed that they needed to do it because they needed to show allegiance to their family, to their state, to their friends, they were on the wrong side of the issue. They should not be idolized. They should not be put on monuments on public spaces. Now, I don't think that we should ban any of these symbols from private spaces. So if you want to fly the Confederate flag off your pickup truck and show your ignorance, well, you should be free to do so. If you want to erect an enormous statue to Robert E. Lee on a private property and show your ignorance, you should be allowed to do so. But no federal money, no state money should be allowed to go to these things. What would you think if Germany started erecting statues to Nazi leaders because they're historical figures? Let's say not even Hitler himself, or Himmler, or Goebbels. What about the good Nazi, Albert Speer, the only one who wasn't sentenced to death, the rehabilitated Nazi? Should we erect a monument to him? Would that be okay? What about the Nazis who worked in the gas chambers who all said they didn't want to do it? They didn't agree with it. They didn't hate Jews. They were just doing their job. They were Germans. Germans fight for Germany. Should we make statues for them? Should we carve them on the side of some mountain? No, these people made an alliance with immorality, with a disgusting worldview. Even if in their mind they weren't. They had extenuating circumstances that pushed them there. Now, how is that fundamentally different than people that are aligning themselves with what we're seeing today. You're on the wrong side. Now, the right side is not the side of those policemen in Minneapolis. The world is not binary. I do not have to support those 4 policemen and what they did in order to stand against both the rioters and the protesters. I am not forced to choose a side. I can tell you that what those 4 policemen did was wrong, was excessive, should have never gotten to that point. Now, I'm not sure how serious the actual crime they committed is. I know everybody wants to just assume that they're guilty of first or second or third degree murder. You got it all pinned down. But I've watched the videos, and there's way too many gaps in there. These videos, these aren't the videos of yesteryear, the kind of video camera that they use to take pictures of UFOs and Bigfoot. They're all grainy and you can't tell what's happening. These are high-quality videos recorded on a digital medium that records for endless hours without stopping, and yet they're very edited. And we do not see critical moments of the interaction to know just how much of a crime these officers might have committed. Now, we do know that there came a point where they should have not continued to hold him down. Now, you and I might disagree when that moment was, but it's hard to know when that moment was without being able to see how he ended up on the ground. How did he go from the driver's side of the car? How did he get over to the passenger side of the car? And what happened in that time period? We don't know. All the videos are very conspicuously cut short at that moment. I find that very difficult. Now, I just read an article saying that the defense is suggesting that when the body cams of the officers are made public and the video that is missing out of the videos that we have seen, that the officers are going to have a very strong defense. Now, what I suspect might happen, and this is going to cause a tremendous amount of upheaval again if this happens, but I suspect that that video is going to show that the interaction between George Floyd and those officers was not peaceful, that he was not a peaceful, non-resisting victim who the officers had every intent to kill. I suspect we're going to find that he resisted. Now, that doesn't mean that they have a right to kill him. I can't believe we have to say that, but you always have to make the caveat, because there's always some person out there who's going to say, well, what you're saying then is that the police should have killed him. No, that is not what anybody is saying. And it could, as far as I can tell, those officers, at least, at the very least, should have immediately tried to revive him when they saw he was unresponsive. If he fought them vigorously, because he was a very big man and a very strong man, he worked professionally as a bouncer in a bar. If he fought those officers vigorously, then they were well within their rights to try to restrain him and hold him down. Now, maybe the method they used was not the appropriate one, holding him on his stomach and pushing on his neck and back. But they are within their rights if that happened, and nobody knows. We don't have the video, but if that happens, then they are well within their rights to restrain him and hold him down. But there was obviously a moment where he had spent himself. He was tired out and he was no longer resisting. And even though there's always the risk that these criminals, or these subjects I should say, are faking, and they're not really tired, and they're just trying to get a little bit of space so that they can attack the cops, and that has happened many, many times, even on video. There's always that danger. But those policemen have a responsibility to assume that risk It is not their right to assume the risk that he could die. They have to assume the risk of themselves being killed and not allow him to become unresponsive. So I think that we can know pretty clearly that there was a moment, probably 4 minutes before the ambulance got there, when that man should have been sat up, should have been revived if necessary, should have been treated as a victim at that point instead of as a suspect. But until we see all the evidence, until we see everything that actually happened, you and I are just speculating in the dark. And it's easy to look at that horrible 8 or 9 minute video at the end and think you know something. We don't know yet. This is not obviously the popular opinion, nor will it be. But Christians have never been called upon to be popular. We're supposed to care about the truth. And in this instance, we don't know what the truth is yet. We only know parts of it. And it seems to me very obvious that there are elements involved who do not want us to know the truth. The owner of the convenience store that released the security camera footage that shows from the moment he got arrested, led across the street, and they tried to put him in the car on the driver's side, for some reason, he cut that video short at that moment. That is not accidental. That makes me suspicious that something is being concealed. So we should be very careful and cautious before we go and say that the cops were justified or that they weren't. Should be cautious. Now, for all I know, the video is going to show the police being worse than we thought they were. I mean, that is very well a possibility. Just as it's possible that we find out that he fought them vigorously and put their lives in jeopardy, it's also possible to find out that they were beating him up in the car and he's just trying to escape because they are abusing him and that they should go to jail, all of them, for second-degree murder. That's very likely also, or very possible. And I am more than open for that to be the case. I have no invested interest in defending anybody here. What I do care about is what is true and what is borne out by the facts. And that's what I think all Christians should be looking at. Tomorrow, which will be Saturday at 9 a.m., Brando Elliott will be here. He's a friend of mine. Goes to the same church where I used to go and attend, and he's going to be here on the podcast, and we're going to be talking about Mexico because he's an expatriate of Mexico. And so we're going to be talking about Mexico. We'll actually talk some about this issue and how and what his perspective is being from Mexico and knowing how the Mexican legal system, the Mexican police departments operate. I'm curious as to his perspective on all of this. So we'll be talking about that and other things. I hope you'll join us. That's tomorrow at 9 a.m. Also, if you want to respond or interact with me, you can email me at podcast@freebornchurch.com, or you can put the comments on the YouTube video, and we will read them. Thank you for being with us, and have a great day.